अबराज ग्रुप के फाउंडर और मशहूर पाकिस्तानी आरिफ नकवी इस वक्त लंदन में मौजूद है और अमेरिकन हुकूमत की जो एक्सट्रेडिशन प्रोसीडिंग्स है वो जारी हैं। अमेरिकन हुकूमत की ख्वाहिश है कि आरिफ नकवी को लंदन से अमेरिका ले जाया जाए। आरिफ नकवी ने जहाँ पर लीगल फाइट पुट अप की हुई है, उनकी स्टोरी पूरे वेस्ट में और ख़ास तौर पर जो वेस्टर्न प्रेस है उसमें पिछले तकरीबन 2 साल से वो डिस्कस हो रही है। आरिफ नकवी ने अबराज ग्रुप बनाया था, एक वक्त में वो तकरीबन 14 बिलियन के जो फंड्स थे वो मैनेज कर रहे थे, लेकिन फिर आरिफ नकवी के ख़िलाफ़ मुख्तलिफ चार्जेस लाए गए और अब अबराज ग्रुप का ख़ात्मा हुआ। आरिफ नकवी के हवाले से जो वॉल स्ट्रीट जर्नल है उसके कुछ जर्नलिस्ट ने एक किताब लिखी है जिसको द की मैन के नाम से जाना जाता है, जिसमें आरिफ नकवी पर बहुत सारे जो इल्ज़ामात जो डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ जस्टिस ने लगाए हैं उनको दोहराया गया है और उसमें बहुत सारे उनके ऊपर इल्ज़ामात हैं। लेकिन आरिफ नकवी की जो ज़िंदगी और ख़ास तौर पर आरिफ नकवी का जो केस है, जो अमेरिकन हुकूमत का केस है, उसके हवाले से एक बहुत ही अहम तहकीकात, एक बहुत ही अहम रिसर्च की है और उसको एक बुक की शक्ल में सामने लाए। किंगस्टन यूनिवर्सिटी के साबिक़ प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर ब्रायन ब्रिवेटी ने जो इकरस द लाइफ एंड डेथ ऑफ अबराज के नाम से जो उन्होंने अपना जो रिसर्च वर्क किया है, उसमें प्रोफेसर ब्रायन का ये कहना है कि आरिफ नकवी के ऊपर जितने भी जो इल्ज़ामात हैं उनका ये कहना है कि उनकी जो कोर है, जो वो बुनियाद है, वो इस बात पर है कि आरिफ नकवी के साथ जो हुआ, उनका ये कहना है कि जो अबराज ग्रुप है वो डूबा नहीं बल्कि उसको डुबोया गया। जो अबराज ग्रुप था आरिफ नकवी का, उसको आग नहीं लगी बल्कि उसको खुद आग नहीं लगी बल्कि उसको आग लगाई गई। और ये कि आरिफ नकवी का जो आज जिस कंडीशन में जो उनके साथ हुआ उसका डायरेक्ट जो रिलेशन है वो कराची इलेक्ट्रिक की सेल से है, जियो पॉलिटिक्स से है। और ये वो सारी बातें उन्होंने अपनी एक रिसर्च की बेस पर, एविडेंस की बेस पर कही। हम प्रोफेसर ब्रायन ब्रिवेटी से जानते हैं आपको कि उनकी जो पूरी रिसर्च है आरिफ नकवी के हवाले से वो क्या है। प्रोफेसर ब्रायन, द रिसर्च यू हैव डन ऑन आरिफ नकवी tells a very gripping story of what happened to Arif Naqvi. Can you summarize for us, for our viewers, what happened to Arif Naqvi?
What happened to Arif Naqvi and the Abraaj group is a political hitman operation which took down a very successful private equity company operating in emerging markets around the world. And when I came to the story, I found that he had been accused, he'd been tried, and he'd been convicted in the Western press. And I felt there was another side to this story. And so when I researched it out, I found that there was. It's a very complicated story. There are many sides to it. And I think it was right to try and write a book that put the other side of the story.
Why did you take interest in Arif Naqvi's life and his work? And what is the other side? If you could tell us, as you say, that the other side of the story. What is that other side of the story?
So the other side of this story is that Arif Naqvi was a successful Pakistani private equity man. He'd created a firm with $14 billion under management based in Dubai, operating in London and New York. It was extremely successful from 2002 to 2016, and then very suddenly it collapsed. Now, when you see a sudden collapse like that, you should begin to ask yourself, why and how did this happen? And what I found is that it happened because of a specific deal, the deal to sell Karachi Electric to the Chinese, which the US government did not want to happen. It happened because private equity executives in the US, like Tom Barrack, the head of Colony Capital, who's just been arrested as a foreign agent of the United Arab Emirates in the US, wanted to take control of the Abraaj investments in those emerging markets, and because of internal problems in the firm. So what I'd seen was a one-dimensional picture: Arif Naqvi, a Pakistani, a criminal, a fraudster, and in reality it's a very complicated story. He made mistakes, certainly, but he's not a crook, he's not a thief, and he's not a fraudster.
Your story suggests that Arif Naqvi did not come down, he was taken down, that the Abraaj group did not catch fire, but it was put on fire. What is your basis of saying that?
The basis of saying that Abraaj was burnt down was the speed at which the company collapsed, the way in which key information was released into the Western media and was exposed in the Wall Street Journal and other journals at key moments during the process of collapse, but also in particular the actions of key individuals. So there were unsecured creditors with strong interests in the United States who pushed for a liquidation process which would have ensured they never got paid back. Naqvi devised, with the help of Julian Loki, a restructuring package which would have paid everybody back. But that was vetoed by these same unsecured creditors with interests in the United States. And look at who benefited, who picked up the funds at the end. All investors were paid back with interest, or they're still making money. Those funds that are still making money are now run by US, UK private equity firms who picked them up for a fraction of what they would have cost if the company had not collapsed.
You have linked Arif Naqvi's fate with that of the sale of Karachi Electric. How do you see the whole issue around Karachi Electric sale? How do you see the whole Karachi Electric sale and the geopolitics, and especially the rivalry between the US and China playing into it, and then all of that being linked with Arif Naqvi?
So the heart of this story is Karachi Electric. Arif Naqvi invested in Karachi Electric in 2008. The WikiLeaks cables show the US Embassy welcoming that investment and looking forward to that company being turned round. For those of you who live in Karachi, you know progress was made for a while with that company when it was controlled by Abraaj. Investment went in. A private equity company holds a share in a company over a period of time, then it sells it for a profit. Naqvi wanted to sell Karachi Electric to Shanghai Electric. But much more than that, he'd created a new global fund, ABF6, which had 1 billion of Chinese investment coming into it. He was also considering selling a chunk of Abraaj to the Chinese, which would have given them a stronghold in emerging markets. So, because of the geopolitics of Karachi within Pakistan and Pakistan in the broader Belt and Road Initiative, the US did not want Karachi Electric belonging to the Chinese, but also they didn't want the Chinese having this kind of exposure in emerging markets. Everything points to the Americans working with their friends within the Pakistani establishment to slow and stop that sale.
What are the main differences between the key arguments as put forth in The Key Man and The Life and Death of the Abraaj Group, especially in reference to the criminal conspiracy and the allegations that have been leveled against Arif Naqvi?
So there are two books looking at this case at the moment, The Key Man and my book, Icarus. The Key Man is a one-dimensional account. In it, Arif Naqvi is a criminal. The Department of Justice indictment has been taken uncritically. They've done a huge amount of research, they've talked to lots of people, but they haven't seen any of the defense case. Now, I haven't seen the defense case, but I don't believe that you can write an account like this until you have seen the other side of the story. So I dug in as far as I could into the other side of the story, and my account is, I think, a multi-dimensional account. There are problems in the firm. Arif Naqvi made mistakes, certainly, particularly at the end of the company when there was a cash flow problem caused by the failure to sell Karachi Electric. But that is not enough of an explanation. It's far too simplistic and subjective to simply put the case against Arif Naqvi as though I was an Attorney General or prosecutor, which is what the Key Man book does. You've got to look at a broader picture. You've got to set the company in the context of Pakistani politics, geopolitics, China and the US, and my book is different in that it sets out that much broader geopolitical picture.
What does your research on Arif Naqvi reveal as opposed to the allegations and the narrative that has been put forth as a result of the allegations which have been made by the American Department of Justice?
There are a few elements in particular of the Department of Justice indictment we should look at carefully. Firstly, it's very selectively presented, and so I was very cautious as to how I used it. I haven't seen all the email traffic, all the WhatsApp traffic. For example, there's one occasion where there's 3 weeks between one message and another message, because indictments are designed to convince grand juries that you have a case. So there are elements within it which need very, very careful analysis. Secondly, one of the major allegations is that Abraaj couldn't move funds around different positions within the company in order to pay expenses on a day-by-day basis. Now that is governed by the limited partner agreement. The competent authority governing that was the Dubai Financial Authority. They fined Abraaj 300 million. Abraaj, in the normal course of events, would have challenged that and they would have fought it out. I don't know, Abraaj might have lost that, but that's a civil authority dealing with a civil matter. Instead, what Naqvi and his colleagues face now is a criminal prosecution with charges of theft, conspiracy and fraud. And I don't think those charges stand up at all. The other matter is that each of the funds was governed by their own company, and then there was a holding company, Abraaj Holding Limited. No questions have been asked about Abraaj Holding Limited as an entity. Its creditors and shareholders had no problems. 4 or 5 investors and 1 creditor in 1 fund are the people who raised these questions. Everything else was working perfectly well. So again, that seems to me an issue for the competent authority, the Dubai Financial Authority, to deal with in a civil matter. It's not a criminal case. And I believe actually that when this ever gets, if it does ever get in front of a judge in the US, it's going to be thrown out.
Did Arif Naqvi steal 385 million as he has been accused of? If not, then what happened to those 385 million?
So let's be clear, this 385 million number is a number that has come up in the liquidation papers. It's a request for information about the location of funds. That request came about during the extradition hearings. What do we know? We know that all funds were returned to all investors, or all funds are still invested and are still earning interest, and when they're sold, they'll return with a profit. We know that all creditors would have been paid back if the restructuring plan that was penned in August 2018 had been implemented, but there are creditors who are owed money. We also know that Naqvi had a remuneration package. Now, for you and I, Murtaza, this was an incredibly generous package, millions of dollars, but in the private equity industry, it was perfectly normal. Indeed, he took a smaller cut of carried interest than most private equity founding partners do. So to answer your question, we need to see his full remuneration package over all those years to see whether, as he claims, every single penny that he was paid, he earned, every single penny was governed by the board and his agreements with the board, and everything is written down. And that's something that he comes back to in his letters from his lawyers, and he said in interviews with me, and it strikes me as being crucial to this. These are very odd conspirators who keep careful minutes of all their meetings, and those are available. They're very odd fraudsters who pay back the people they're supposed to have stolen from with interest, with a profit. And they're very odd thieves if all of these payments were governed by the remuneration package that he was entitled to as the founder of the private equity company.
There has been a lot of discussion in Pakistani media about Arif Naqvi paying monies to Pakistani politicians. What do you have to say? What does your research say? Did Arif Naqvi pay bribes to Pakistani politicians? And
As far as I know, there were no bribes paid to Pakistani politicians. Arif Naqvi made financial contributions to the 2013 campaign by Imran Khan, and he got friends to help make other kinds of contributions. But, and let's be very clear about this, if the Department of Justice had actual evidence, other than there are a couple of lines buried in one email which allude to the payment of money, if the Department of Justice had evidence, Arif Naqvi would have been charged under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Up to now, he's not been charged, which suggests to me that there isn't evidence. There were certainly donations, but the biggest donations in the history of American private equity were made to Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. In other words, the private equity industry make donations. They want beneficial tax regimes, they want political influence in the highest places. The other thing to say about Naqvi is he certainly had influence. His charities in Karachi had spent $150 million creating the ambulance service. He was extremely well known for his philanthropy. He was well known as advisor to the Imran Khan government. So yes, he absolutely had influence. I've seen no evidence, and the DOJ clearly has seen no evidence, because they haven't charged him under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that he did pay bribes.
why has the Western press taken a certain narrative, certain line in Arif Naqvi?
The Naqvi story was a good story for the Western media. It had a Pakistani at its heart. It looked an easy sell as a story of corruption, as the Muslim Bernie Madoff. So on the one hand, for Western media, it hit all the stereotypes. Secondly, it came as the third of three big stories. We've got the Malaysian 1MBD story. We've got the Bernie Madoff story. This looked like number three. So any journalists who might have missed out on their Pulitzer Prizes for 1 and 2 had an opportunity of winning a prize for number 3. And thirdly, I think there is a hunger for these kinds of stories in the media. That obviously it's a hugely competitive industry, and I completely understand that. There's a hunger for headlines, but also within the Murdoch organization, there's very close links to American private equity. This was an upstart company, an Arab company run by a Pakistani. So I think there are layers of identity politics, of journalistic competitiveness, of the search for the next story. And I think what happened, to be brutally honest, is that some journalists got path dependent. Once the story began to break, they were part of the story, because Wall Street Journal articles were key in the unfolding story itself, but also it kind of had to end in the way they want it to end, which is this guy being found guilty. Not because they want him to go to prison or anything like that, but because the narrative that they've constructed needs that finale. You need that finish. You've started this news cycle. There's only one way it ends. If it ends quietly with somebody saying, well, actually, we withdraw the charges, pay your fines, that's no good to the newsroom. What's good for the newsroom is this guy being extradited and put in jail for 290 years, whether or not he's innocent or guilty.
Do you think Arif Naqvi has been singled out by the corporate capitalist interest because he was not liked, also because he was an outsider, a Muslim, a Pakistani, a brown man? And what if Arif Naqvi was not a brown man? What if he was a white man working on the Wall Street?
He was singled out because Karachi Electric was going to be sold to the Chinese. But once that process begins, he's in a much weaker position, right? He isn't one of us. So people in the City of London didn't close ranks behind him in the private equity world of London, in the clubs of London. They didn't say, we've got to look after this guy, as they might have done if he'd been a white guy from Eton and Oxford who was working at Goldman Sachs. Equally in New York, they didn't close around him because he wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I'm not saying that no people of colour work in private equity companies. But what I'm saying is he had a sort of triple whammy against him. He was trying to sell Karachi Electric to the Chinese. He was a Pakistani head of a private equity company that was very successful in emerging markets. He was doing that in Dubai, and once he was no longer useful to the Arabs, he was chucked out. And he was doing it in London and New York, where he was different and therefore vulnerable. So no, he wasn't singled out because of his race, but his position. And let's be clear, it's an illusion to suggest that he would be treated the same way if he'd been a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or an Eton boy in London. It simply would have been different.
You have met Arif Naqvi a few times. What is your view of him as a person, as a businessman, and as the head of Abraaj? Is he a crook? Did he steal money? And is he guilty of what he's being accused of?
Met him, I interviewed him. He's not a crook. At heart, as I've said before, he's a Pakistani patriot. He's a hugely articulate, very, very smart guy who I think passionately believed in himself and in impact investment. He believed in Abraaj, and he believed in the ability of private equity to do good. So I think he's all those things. I don't think he's a crook. I think he made mistakes, and I think the team made mistakes in that crisis period. But those were mistakes that deserved a civil trial, a fine, possibly even some period in jail. They don't deserve criminal charges and 300 years in a US jail.
You covered the trial of Arif Naqvi at various courts in London. Why do you think the government of Pakistan did not come to his help, especially in view of the fact that Prime Minister Imran Khan used to be his very close friend, the President of Pakistan, and Arif Naqvi was also once very close to, he knew very well the leadership of Pakistan, Muslim League Nawaz, and many other leading politicians and the current government figures.
Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it, that he, on the one hand, Arif Naqvi is accused of paying fines to Pakistani politicians. He's mistakenly reported to have given the police Imran Khan's phone number when he was arrested. He didn't. That was the last number that he called before he left Pakistan, according to his account. But the point is, if he had all this power and influence, if he paid all these bribes, then why was he arrested and why was he kept in jail? And why has the Pakistani government, up to this point, not stood up and tried to defend him? And I think, firstly, that speaks to the fact that I don't think he has the kind of power and influence that much of the Western media has suggested that he did. And secondly, that Pakistan hasn't known what to do about this. And let's be clear, the treaty between the UK and the US, the extradition treaty, is a broken treaty that is not fit for purpose. Julian Assange was getting blanket media coverage when he was being extradited. Arif Naqvi was barely supported. I think there's a huge amount the Pakistani government could do to support him and could use their influence with the UK government to help him not escape trial, but have a trial in a civil court in the UK where I think he stands a chance.
Arif Naqvi returned his monies to the creditor, but even after that, he's being pursued with so much effort. I mean, what do you think is the reason that the US government is so much after him? I mean, what is it that the US government and the DOJ are trying to do?
All the money went to all the investors with interest. Creditors are still owed money, but there was a restructuring plan that if it had been implemented and Karachi Electric's sale had been completed, would have paid them back. So there was a way in which this didn't happen, right? The Dubai authority, the competent authority, dealt with it with a fine, and the company was allowed to continue. That would have been much better for everybody. All the creditors, all the investors, the company would have carried on to run. The company would have carried on running, perhaps with new management, who would have been paid back. So there has to be a different catalyst as to why the judicial overreach of the Department of Justice was such that they launched this massive criminal investigation against Arif Naqvi. And I think that's to do with Karachi Electric and the Chinese and US trade war. But once one of these cases gets going, there's a huge impetus behind it. Resources are devoted to it. It's very difficult for the DOJ to turn around and say, actually, we got this wrong. They have been heavily criticized on a number of recent occasions for their judicial overreach. I think this is another example of that. But until it gets before a judge in the US, it's very hard to stop the juggernaut of the Department of Justice forcing through and ruining multiple lives in the process.
How do you respond to the allegation that you have written a fake story and that you have put up the theories which do not have any basis? These are the kind of some of the allegations which have been made since your research was published by some of your critics.
So far, since my book was published, the only people who've said that I'm peddling fake news or making up theories are the authors of the book that I'm competing with, The Key Man. And specifically, Simon Clarke has said that I'm making up stories and making up fake news, and that he is completely objective. Firstly, there are no objective accounts. We are all subjective. We all bring our experiences and our prejudices to every story that we write and every book that we write and the way in which we look at evidence. So I reject the notion that his account is objective and my account is subjective. Secondly, there is no fake news. My job as a historian is to look at facts and construct theories to explain why things happened in the way that they happened. And when I looked at this story, there were too many holes in it for the one-dimensional story being peddled by the Murdoch media empire to be true, and I began digging, and I've presented what I passionately believe is an alternative interpretation of the events of what happened to the Abraaj group and what happened to Arif Naqvi. And I'm very happy, I'll be delighted to debate Simon Clarke on any platform, anytime, face-to-face on all of these issues.
Arif Naqvi has done a lot of good work in Pakistan as well, did a lot of philanthropy, he helped a lot of people. What do you think is now that whatever has happened to him, what do you think is going to define his legacy?
Arif Naqvi's legacy will be the ambulance service in Karachi, the Aman Foundation and its other works. So lots of people, individual families who were touched by that, will know him for that work. The impact investment of the Abraaj group in multiple emerging markets, in hospitals that were built, in schools, in building consumer goods, a new middle class, those people, insofar as they know that it's connected to him, will remember him for that. And young people I know who he mentored over many years in many different companies will remember him for that. We don't know, though, how this story ends. We don't know if his appeal for extradition will be allowed. If it is not allowed and he gets a fair trial in the UK, then there is a chance that his legacy will not include prison at the end of it. If, however, he is extradited to the United States, firstly, I fear for his life, because as was made clear in court, his mental health is deteriorating, he's in poor shape in that way. Also, I fear for a man of his age going into a US prison with that kind of a sentence. So everything now depends on what the High Court in London decides. And if I'm right, then hopefully this man gets a fair trial in the UK. And if he deserves punishment, he gets that punishment. If I'm wrong and he does get extradited to the US, then I don't believe he will survive and I think his legacy will be ever tainted by that.